All right, guys. So today we're going to finally tackle the mountain that is Redux. And I tried to hold off going over Redux for as long as possible because I didn't want to overcomplicate things for you guys. I wanted to make sure that you guys understood how to build applications without Redux. And then that way, once we introduce Redux, you'd at least know what it brings to the table and you could learn to make a decision on your own when you should use Redux and when you shouldn't. Because I think too many times new programmers just kind of slap Redux onto every application, even on applications that don't necessarily need it. Now, with Redux, I will tell you that the first time I go over this, you guys probably will not understand it. That's what happened to me when I was first trying to learn Redux. I just could not wrap my head around it, and I kind of gave up for a bit. And then a month later, I came back and gave it another shot, and then it finally started to kind of piece together. And so, if you guys struggle with trying to understand Redux at first, just take a break. And when I say take a break, I mean just don't look at any React or any Redux code for a week and then come back to it with a clear mind and learn it from scratch. And usually that second time around, you'll see that you'll start to get bits and pieces of how Redux works at that point. Anyways, let's get to it. And I think the first thing that we should talk about is what exactly Redux is. Redux is a state management library. So it's going to handle the logic for managing your application state, creating it, editing it, updating your state, deleting your state. Redux is going to handle all of that. Now, it's important to understand that Redux isn't exclusive to React. It can actually be used with any other framework or library. So if you want to build out a web app in Vue, you can technically use Redux as your state management library. If you want to build a mobile application using Flutter, we can use Redux with that as well. Now, Redux happens to be the main state management library for React, so it's really become synonymous with React. And I think that's why a lot of people seem to think that, Redux is part of React, but it's not. It's a totally separate third-party library. Now, Redux is also a way of architecting applications that decouple UI from state and app logic. And that's because it employs the Flux architecture. And so, if you guys are curious about that, I definitely recommend you, read up on it because Redux utilizes it heavily. And so Redux is going to kind of force us into a certain design pattern of where we, have a lot of our business and state logic outside of our React components. And so that way our React components are strictly just handling the UI. And that's a good thing, right? And till now, we've actually been putting all of our app logic within a React component. And even though that's not necessarily bad, it's definitely better to, separate those two things. And one of those reasons is, let's say down the road, you find that React isn't working for you and you want to try a different UI library or framework. Maybe you want to go to Vue. Maybe you want to try, whatever is the new hot flavor of the month. You'll see that if all of your logic is within a React component, it's going to be very hard to migrate your code over to that new framework. However, if all of your business and app logic have been moved outside of React components to just, plain JavaScript essentially, then migrating to a new framework will be dead simple. All right, so I think that covers what Redux is. Let's take a look at, the benefits that Redux provides and why we ultimately want to use Redux. So the first thing is Redux provides a global state. And so this global state will make it so that any component can access it as well as update and modify it without having to pass it down as props from one component to another. And so, if you guys have been following along with my course, then you've already seen an example of, how awesome this is by using the context API, because the context API also provides a similar thing. However, Redux provides much more than just a global state. However, this is kind of one of the first things that people think about when they think of Redux. It's that it provides that global state that any component can access and update without having to, pass it down as a prop from one component to another. Now, Redux will also provide a single source of truth when it comes to state. That's pretty important as well. We don't want to kind of have our state kind of segregated from different in different places throughout our code. And so we want that single source of truth. Now, Redux, as I stated before, it enforces a specific design pattern where we decouple the UI from the state. And I just already explained the benefits of that. So keep that in mind. I think the next bullet point is probably the most important in my opinion, and it's that Redux provides amazing debugging capabilities as well as the ability to time travel. And I'll talk about what that actually means if you aren't familiar with that. But by utilizing the Redux dev tools, you'll see that it's just become so much easier to work with your React application and troubleshoot various issues that revolve around state. Because we'll have the ability to kind of go back in time at any point in time within the life cycle of your app to see what was the exact state of your application. And we can start troubleshooting from any point in time. And that's going to save you a ton of time when it comes to troubleshooting. And then finally, Redux also provides us the ability to use custom middleware to perform extra tasks like logging, error tracking, and caching and things of that nature. Now, if you guys have done any research on Redux or been to any subreddit or read any kind of tutorials or documents online, you'll see that a lot of people struggle with Redux. And it's definitely a confusing point for a lot of people that are new to React and programming. And I kind of want to go over why people struggle with it so much before I actually get into the details of how Redux works. And one of the first reasons why people struggle with Redux is that there's just a ton of new terminology that gets thrown at you. Right? So you have to be familiar with what a store is, what an action is, what is a reducer, what is a dispatch, when are these different components of Redux, when do they come into play in our application and what do they do? And you'll continually forget what each one is and what each one does. And that makes it a little bit more difficult to actually wrap your head around the whole idea behind Redux. The second thing that makes Redux so difficult is that there's a lot of boilerplate. So when we set up Redux in our application, you'll see that we'll have to write a decent amount of more code to actually get things up and running. Whereas if we weren't using Redux, it would be significantly simpler. And I don't necessarily agree with this. I don't think there's a ton of boilerplate. There's definitely some extra things that you need to do to get things up and running. But I wouldn't say it's too bad. But keep in mind that a lot of people do get kind of annoyed by that. The next bullet point, Redux is dumb. And when I say dumb, I don't mean, oh, Redux is stupid and you shouldn't use it. I mean, Redux itself knows nothing about your application. It doesn't make any assumptions. You have to explicitly tell it everything it needs to do. And I think when we start to work with Redux and we actually get to the point where we're implementing everything in Redux, I think it confuses people because they're like, well, if I have to tell it everything that I needed to do, what is it really bringing to the table? And if you can't see the benefits of Redux, it's hard to actually use Redux, right? Because if you don't know why you're using it, or if you don't think it's actually helping you, then you just kind of lose that motivation to really learn it and implement it in your applications in a proper way. And the next bullet point kind of tags on to that previous one, and that's that to actually see the benefits of Redux, you have to have a moderately complex application. And if you're just learning React or programming in general, you're not building very complex applications, right? You're probably just building your traditional to-do list, maybe like a blogging application, which is pretty much just a to-do list in disguise. And with those applications, you just don't need Redux. Your state just isn't complex enough. Your application is just too basic to actually utilize the true benefits of Redux. And finally, we're going to be decoupling the UI from the application logic and state. And this is not really an option. We kind of have to do it with Redux. But it makes it difficult to learn Redux because now you're kind of learning two different things at once, right? You have to learn, Redux itself as well as this new way of programming where we no longer shove all of our logic into our components and move it to separate files. And so, learning two things at once is always more difficult than just learning one thing at once. But anyways, I think that kind of covers all of the challenge that come with learning Redux. In the next slide, we're going to talk about what are the benefits of global state. And if you've already watched my context API videos, I'm just going to do that same presentation on that. So if you've already seen that, then feel free to skip that to the point. Feel free to skip that and just go to the slides where I actually start breaking down the individual pieces of Redux. So let's talk about why we want to have global state and what it brings to the table. So to actually kind of go over that, what I want to do is kind of give you this hypothetical scenario. And let's say we've built out this application, and you can see in this application, we've got a root component at the top, and then we've got all of the child components within there. And let's say we've implemented state in that green component right there. And we probably did that using use state or use reducer. Now, let's say that one of our child components, all the way at the bottom down there, that red guy wants access to that state. How would we make it so that that component could get that state? Well, we'd have to pass it down as a prop. However, this component is not directly attached to the green component. So we would have to pass it to our purple component as a prop, and that component would then have to pass it as a prop down to the red component. And then he can finally access that state. And on top of that, this is just accessing the state. If he wants to modify the state, then we're going to have to pass down the event handlers through the purple component as a prop and then finally down to the red component. Not necessarily a big deal, but you can start to see how this would slowly become more of a problem, right? Imagine if our red component was 5 components deep from the green component, we'd have to pass our state, 5 levels deep just so that one component all the way at the bottom could access it. Now let's say that we have another component all the way on the left who wants access to that state. Well, how would we give that state that exists within the green component to that red component? Well, we'd have to lift our state. So we'd have to find the lowest common denominator component that has access to both of these red components. And in our scenario, it's going to be our root component. So we'd have to lift our state all the way to our root component, right? And that's going to involve a little bit of refactoring, a little bit of extra work now, because we've taken the state that it used to exist in the green component and we had to move it all the way to the blue component. Then what we have to do is take our state and then pass it down as a prop through each level until we can get to those 2 components. And so now look at all of the components that need to touch our state before we can actually get it to those 2 components, right? That's a bit tedious and there's no need for those components to have to even interact with the state. So why are we passing it down to them? It seems incredibly inefficient. Now, guys, I want to give you a real world scenario of how having a global state can be very beneficial. So let's say, we're taking a look at Reddit here, and Reddit has implemented a dark mode feature. And I'm telling you right now that the dark mode setting, whether the user has it checked or not, is definitely something you'd want to store in your global state. And we wanted to think about why that is. So if I go here, first of all, let's actually take a look at this application and just notice the different colorings of each portion of our app. And, I'm sure you can, and I'm sure, with all of the things that we've learned with React up to this point, you're already kind of trying to break down how we would break this website down into different components. So we might have this header component, we might have a search component, right? All of this stuff may be another component. The user information and the user settings might be another component. We'd probably have all of this body right here. That's another component. You'd have this kind of banner. You'd probably have a banner component. Then all of our posts down here, these are going to be components. The sidebar would be a component with a few different child components like the top growing communities. We got another advertisement component and so on. So we've got several different components on this website. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into this setting right here and I'm going to toggle night mode. And I want you guys to look at which components need to update their UI. All right. And so if your answer is everything, well, then you're correct. We had to pretty much change the coloring of every single component in our application, which would mean every single component in our app would need to have access to that dark mode state. And so we could, keep our state in our root app component and pass it down to, potentially hundreds of different components, or we could store our state in a global state. And that way each component can access it directly without having to actually need to pass it down from one component to another and have every component have to touch this state. Now let's talk about how we can actually implement this global state. How do we make it so that components can access the state directly without having to receive it as a prop from a parent component? Well, what we would do is we would create a custom component called a provider component. And what this component is going to do is it's going to wrap our entire application. So we would take our app component and pass it in as a child prop to the provider component. And by wrapping our entire application within this provider component, the state that's stored within that provider component can be accessed by any child component in our application. And so that way, if the two components at the bottom want access to the state, they can go directly to the provider and get that state. And this is going to greatly simplify our application and make it so much easier to work with state. However, I want you to keep in mind that this doesn't mean we shove all state into that global state within the provider component. You're still going to have local state for different components within your application that don't necessarily need to be part of the global state. And I want you guys to kind of think about, what state would be, state that doesn't need to be stored in the global state. Well, state that doesn't need to be shared between components should always stay as a local state. So if we were building a form component that has a few input fields, right? We're going to have state to make sure that the values within those input fields are, controlled inputs. So we're going to store that as state. But we don't need to share that information to any other component, right? That's just exclusive to that component. So we would want to keep that within that local component. So I would just want you guys to keep in mind that even though we have this global state now with Redux, or or even the context API, it doesn't mean you have to shove everything in there. So you want to make calculated decisions on what state belongs in the global state and what state should remain as local state. All right, guys. So hopefully you guys have a solid understanding of how global state works and what it brings to the table. And we're finally going to get started talking about how Redux works and the different pieces that make up Redux. So this is going to be the most important slide of my slide deck. I want you guys to either screenshot it or save it somehow and then print it out and have it by your keyboard, because as I told you before, one of the real difficult points in learning Redux is that you'll always have a hard time remembering what each one of these things do. And by having this slide printed out, you can always just refer back to that and remember what it does. Okay, so anyways, let's go through the different pieces that make up Redux. The first thing that we have to start with, and the most important piece, is the store. So this is the object that holds the entire state of our application. Right, and so anytime I say store, I want you to just think of this is our state. We then have a reducer, and the reducer is a function that kind of handles all of the logic when it comes to how we manipulate the state. So it's going to have the logic for, let's say we're building a basic blogging app. The reducer is going to have the logic of, what do we do when we create a new post? What do we do when we delete a post? What do we do when we edit a post? What do we do when we want to receive all posts? So that's going to have all of the logic for working with the state and manipulating it. Then we have our action. So this is just a plain JavaScript object that describes the type of change we want to make to our state. And this probably isn't going to make that much sense to you, but basically what's going to happen is our application, the UI, is going to be responsible for receiving feedback from the user of when they want to do something, right? Because if the user clicks create new post, right, the UI is aware that they clicked that button, but now they need to kind of tell the rest of our code to actually perform that action. And the way it does that is by taking an action. Is by taking an action object and then dispatching it. And we'll cover dispatch in a second. All right, then we have action creators. This is technically not mandatory for Redux. All it is it's a function that returns an action. So it's just kind of like a simpler way so that you don't have to type out your entire action. Instead, you just call your action creator, which returns your action. But it is kind of optional, so you don't actually have to use an action creator. And then, as I said before, anytime we want to perform some kind of task in our application, we need to, create an action and then do something with it, right? And so the dispatch function is responsible for taking an action and sending it to the reducer so that we can update the state. And then finally, we have the provider. And so the provider is just a React component that makes the Redux store available to all other components. So the provider is the reason why we have global state. And it's going to be responsible for making sure that all other components can access our store without having to have it passed down from prop to prop. Okay, so let's talk about the Redux store, or as I said before, the state, right? Because the Redux store is responsible for containing the entire state of our application. But what I want you to do is if you're having a hard time kind of understanding or wrapping your head around the store, what I want you to do is just think of it as a plain old JavaScript object called store. So I gave that an example right here. Um, and basically, it's just a plain old object that I called store, and it's going to contain all of our state. And the great part about this is that we can define our state in any way we want to. So we can make it look however we want. In this example, I've got a few parameters. So I've got, is logged in, which is just a Boolean. I've got dark mode, which is just another Boolean. Then I have another property called posts, and that's going to be a list of objects that's going to represent each post of a blog. And then we also have the user property, and that's going to be an object that's going to have two properties, name and role. And so that's going to be the name of the user and then what role they have within the application. So really just moving forward, think of the store as just a JavaScript application that's storing our data in memory. But each property within this object is going to represent a different aspect of our state, right? Because we've got the is logged in and the user, which kind of go together. We also have the dark mode, which is user configuration settings. Then we have like the actual data of our application. So each property represents a different part of our state. And now the next bullet point, this is very important. The store is immutable, and that means that we cannot modify it, right? So if I tried to do, store dot is logged in and then set it to false, that is a no-go. We never modify the state directly. Instead, what we do is we create a brand new state with all the fields set to the values that we want. So if we want to just change is logged in to false or true, and to false or true, depending on the situation, instead of just modifying the store, we create a brand new store. Instead of modifying the store, we just create a brand new store and use that moving forward. Now let's talk about why we ultimately decided to make store immutable. Like, what is the benefits of it? Why shouldn't we just modify it directly? Well, because we're creating a new instance of the store every time we modify the state, what we'll have is a whole bunch of copies of our state over a period of time, over a period of the lifetime of our application. And the great part about this is that because we're keeping each copy of the state, we can essentially go back in any point in time and see the exact state of our application at that point in time and debug our application. And so this is amazing because we won't have to manually click things to get our state to the exact point the user experienced a bug. Instead, we can just go back in time and get to that point and start troubleshooting. So if you guys are having a hard time understanding what that actually looks like, imagine we have our blogging application that we've kind of been using as an example. And let's say at first, when the user goes to our web app, right, the user is not logged in, right? So we see is logged in as false. And after the user logs in, right, we're going to update our state. And so after he's logged in, we changed is logged in to true, right? So now we have two copies of our state. Now this is the current copy, but we maintain the old copy so that, we can time travel. Then let's say the user, now that he's logged in, we actually get some extra information like their name and their role. But let's say the user makes a new post. So after we add a new post to the store, remember, we're not actually adding it to the current store. We're creating a brand new copy of the store and then adding that fourth post in. So now we have three different instances of the store. So we've got the current one, we've got the previous one, and we've got the one before that. And so if the user experienced a bug at this point, maybe you want to go back to right before they made the post to see what that state is in, and then start actually recreating what the customer did. And so you can do that because we've saved this exact state. So we can go back in time, get to this exact point where Angela is logged in, but she hasn't created that fourth post. And that's the benefit of time traveling. That's the benefit of having an immutable state. Right? We're going to have multiple copies of our state. We're going to keep it all just in case we ever want to go back in time and play around in the past. Now let's do a little quick deep dive into Redux actions. Now, as I stated before, Redux actions are just objects, right? And there is no special magic behind an action. It is actually just a plain old JavaScript object. So this is an example of an action to get all posts, right? And so each action must have at least one property, and that's the type property. And so in this case, it's called get post, but you can call it whatever you want. If you wanted you're going to have multiple actions for your application. So you would have an action for create post, and the type would be called create post. You might have one for delete post, and an action for delete post would have a type called delete post or whatever you want to call it. And the type property is really just going to be a string, right? And I guess I forgot to put this in actual quotes, but it's just going to be a string that the reducer can use to basically have an if statement and say, oh, if the user dispatched a get posts action, then I need to return all of our posts. And if they dispatched a create post, then I need to implement the logic of creating a brand new post. Now, an action can also have an optional payload property. So this is an example of an action that has the type as well as the optional payload property. And here's the thing: you don't actually have to call it payload, but in documentation, it's just referenced as payload. So it's going to contain some extra data so that when we send it to the reducer can take that extra data and perform a certain action. So if we were, working on our hypothetical blog application, the payload might be called post, and it would contain the actual data for our post. And then once we sent it to the reducer, if this is an example of let's say like a create post action, then since we're passing the payload, which contains the information of the post, the reducer can then add the post to whatever array is storing all of our posts. Then we have our action creator. And as I stated before, the action creator is optional. And all it does is it's just a function that returns an action, right? So if you look at the return statement of this action creator, it's just a object with a type property and a payload. So this is our action object right here. And this is our action creator. And the action creator just returns an action object. So if we wanted to reference an action, instead of having to type this out, we could just call in create post. But, as I stated before, it is optional. You don't actually have to do that, but it will make your life a little bit easier. Now we've got the reducer. So this is one of the more important parts of Redux, and this is where a lot of the logic of our application is going to take place. So the reducer is a plain old function, and I can't stress that enough. It's not a special Redux function. We don't need to import anything from Redux to create a reducer. It is just a plain function. But this function is going to handle all of the logic when it comes to manipulating the state. And this function requires two different arguments. It's going to require the current state. So what's going to happen is a store is going to get passed in there. So we'll see the current instance of our state, and then we have an action object, right? So, whatever action that we covered in the previous video, like get posts, that's going to get sent to the reducer. So now the reducer has all the data it needs. And from these two things, it should then be able to basically find what the new state should look like, and then it will return that state. So any value that gets returned from our reducer is going to be what the new state will look like. So when we return it, it basically gets whatever we return gets shoved into our store, and that's going to be our new global state. And if you look at how the reducer is set up, what happens is we're just usually going to have a switch statement, and we match on the action.type, right? And if we go back to our action, you'll see that the type is going to determine what kind of action we want to perform. So if it's a get posts, right, then we'll have a case statement for get posts, which I don't have in this example, but I've got one for create post, one for edit post, and one for delete post. So within these case statements, we're going to have the logic for creating a post, as well as one for editing the post, and then for deleting as well. And then after we make any modifications, we then return a brand new state because we never modify the current state. Now to actually run the reducer, what we have to do is take an action and dispatch it. So the dispatch is a special Redux function. And this is an actual Redux function that you have to import from the Redux library. But once you add a action into the dispatch function and then run that, it will then take the action and send it to the reducer so that we can update our state. So this is really what gets the ball rolling on how we make changes to our application. So if the user submits a new blog post, they'll hit a button in the UI, and that button should trigger a dispatch function. And we'll pass in the specific action that we want, or an action creator if we happen to use that. And that will send it to the reducer, who can then make all those changes. Then finally, we have our Redux provider. So the Redux provider It comes from the React Redux library, which you'll find in the next video. There's two different libraries we have to install, but the Redux provider is a plain old React component. And what we're going to do is we're going to take our provider component and wrap our entire application. So you can see here, we've imported the provider component, and within our app component, what we're doing is we're taking the provider and we're wrapping all of the other child components within there so that they can access our store. And you'll see here that the store, which is our state, is getting passed in as a attribute. And so once we pass that as an attribute, all of these other components can then access the state directly. And this should look a little familiar if you guys are familiar with the context API, because it's the same concept, right? We have a provider component that's going to wrap our application and pass the state to all of our child components. All right, guys, so that's most of the theory behind Redux. I want to wrap up by just showing you one little diagram or demo that's going to walk us through how all of these pieces play together. Within a Redux application, we're going to have three main things that are going to be running. We're going to have our UI. And so because we're learning React, our UI is just going to be some React component. We've got our store, which is going to contain all of our state. And then we've got a reducer function, which once again, we use to handle all of the logic for updating and manipulating our state. Now, when we actually want to go and update the state, we have to kind of track and see how we actually go about doing that. Now, when we actually need to update state, usually we're going to trigger that based off of something that happens in the UI. And so let's say a user either clicks a button or submits a form on the UI. Well, now the UI will dispatch an action object, right? So he'll call the dispatch function. He'll pass in an action object with a specific type property. And then he'll also include an optional payload. So the UI is responsible for kicking things off. Once we dispatch an action object, Redux will automatically send that to the reducer function. So it'll send the action object, but it'll also send in another parameter, which is the current state. Because our state, a lot of times when we update our state, it's going to be based off of the current state. So we need to have access to both the action object as well as the current state. Then our reducer function, because it's going to handle all of the logic of our application based off of the action object and the current state, it can then figure out what the new state should be. So it will return the new state. And once it returns the new state, it will pass that off to the store and save that within the store. And that's the basic flow of Redux. Once you can really understand this, you'll see that working with Redux is dead simple and there's nothing else to it. Like this is 100% Redux. There's a few other parts to Redux, like adding middleware and things like that, but this is the core functionality of Redux. The UI triggers, an event, and so it dispatches an action object. The action object and the current state get forwarded to the reducer. The reducer figures out what the new value of the state is and returns that, and that new state will get stored in the store. And then we just repeat that over and over again for any time we need to update our state. All right, guys. So that's it. That is all of the theory I'm going to cover. And in the next video, we're going to go about tackling our first Redux application. All right, guys, so we're going to get started on building our first Redux application. And I'm going to call this the banking app. However, it's really just another counter app in disguise. However, I didn't want to call it a counter app because, you guys are going to be like, oh, we've already done that. That's boring, and then lose interest. So I'm going to stick with that this is a banking app. And the way that this app works is we've got the balance of our application right here. And what we can do is we can perform a few different actions. We can deposit, withdraw, we can collect interest. Obviously, that's not how interest works in real life, but we can collect interest and then we can also delete our account. And so if we want to make a deposit, let's say we want to deposit $5, if we hit deposit, you can see that now our balance, it goes to $5. If we withdraw $2 from that, you'll see that it'll subtract $2 from our balance. If we want to collect interest, you can see that we just collected 3% interest. We can also delete our account, which just sets our balance to 0. And then, so that's going to be the core functionality of the app, and it's going to cover the basics of Redux. However, there's a few other things I want to teach you in Redux, and to do that, I had to add a few extra features to this really stupid application. And so the first one is this amazing button that changes the account type. So right now you can see that we are a checking account. If I click that, it changes to savings account. So obviously very complex. We're going to be doing some really cool stuff. No, I'm just kidding. It's just a simple Boolean that we're going to be storing in our state. And then based off of that, we either render it as a savings account or as a checkings account. But that's going to actually teach us a lot of things on how to actually define our state. And that's why I included that. And then finally, we've got our dummy authentication system. So it starts out as logged out. If we click it, we're now logged in, and we get the option to, sorry, my mistake. We were logged in and then I just logged out. And so if I click this now, it's going to log us in and it's going to give us the option to log out. So it's just a simple, basically these two things are going to do the same thing, but I wanted to call this the authentication system so that I can show you how we can implement two different reducers within our application. And so that's why this was also added in there. But from a logic perspective, it's not really doing anything. We just have a Boolean that just keeps track of whether we're logged in or not, and then it renders out either log in or log out based off of the state of our is logged in Boolean. All right, so let's get to it. I'm going to open up our command line and we're going to create our React app. And so we'll do create React dash app and we'll call this Redux Banking. Okay, so that's finished and we can just cd into that directory. And we'll open that up. Okay, so once that's complete, let's move into that new directory. And let's open up in VS Code. And from here, we're just going to do the routine cleanup. So we'll delete everything. And let's create our new index.js as well as our app component. And I'm just going to create some boilerplate for our app component, as well as in our index file, we're going to do a import React as well as import React router DOM. Then we want to import our app component. Okay, now that we've got that up, let's open up our terminal and let's actually import Redux before we start our application. So there's two different packages that we need to install to get Redux working with React. The first package is going to be Redux, so that's going to contain all the code for Redux. But we also need another package called React-Redux. And this package allows us to integrate Redux into our React application. So we still do need both, but I did want to point out what the differences are between the two. Okay, so once that's done, let's just do an npm start. And let's just make sure that our app is working so far. Okay, and I'm just going to move that here. Looks like we got an error, but that's just because I didn't hit save all. All right, and if I go to our console, we check that. No errors, so everything looks good. And keep in mind, moving forward, the completed app is going to be on the left side, and then this right tab is going to be the one that we're working on. Okay, and so before really proceeding any further, let's just take a look at this app and see what components we'll need. And so I think a good way to break this up is we'll have one component for the authentication. We'll have one component that just displays what the account type is. And then we'll have a main kind of like a banking component that handles most of the logic for our application. So this banking component will have an input. Not an input. It'll have this H1 header that's going to represent our current balance. It's going to have this input field and then these 4 or 5 buttons. All right. So if I actually go to our inspect and then go to components, you'll see all of the components that I have in place. So ignore the provider and the Redux provider. And so within our app component, we've got the auth, we've got the balance, we've got the banking, and then we've got the account status. So let's go ahead and make those. We got auth.jsx. We've got what else? Balance, and then banking, and then account status. Okay, and I'm just going to create some boilerplate for each one of these components so that we can import them into our main app component. And once that's done, I'm going to import it into our app component. So we'll just do we'll start off with the auth at the top. So make sure you actually import it into this file. Then we'll have the, what's after that? Get the balance. Then we've got the banking. And then finally, we've got the account status. Okay, so we've got this wired up. Let's just do a save all. And let's see what this looks like. And we shouldn't see anything on the screen because I'm not actually rendering anything out. But if we check our components, we'll have our 4 different components. And finally, I think just to wrap this video up, I want to make sure we get Bootstrap installed just so we can get those nice pretty buttons. So I'm going to go to getbootstrap.com and then just copy that. And as usual, we will just place it right here and we should be good to go. Okay. So in the next video, we'll go ahead and work on getting the components rendered out. So we see at least some dummy data. And then after that, we can start tackling Redux. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with making our auth component. It's just going to have a simple button. So within this div, we'll have a button component, and we're going to add a class of BTN and a class of BTN-info. And we'll just hard code login. Then let's go to our account status component. Our account status component is also going to be very simple. We're just going to have an H1 tag, and I'm just going to hard code savings account. Then within our balance, this is also going to be another very simple component. So we're just going to have an H1 tag, and this is going to store the balance. So I'm just going to say $100. Then we got to get to the banking component. So this is going to be our most complex component. And what we want here is, first of all, let's separate those divs and let's add a class. So we'll do class name equals form-group. And then within this form, we want an input tag. And that's going to have a class of form-control as well. Then we want those 5 buttons. So let's do button. Let's see. We're going to need button with the class of BTN and then BTN-success. And this is going to say deposit. We're going to get another button with the class of BTN and BTN-primary. And this is going to say withdraw. The next button is going to have a class of BTN and BTN-warning. And this is going to say collect interest. So we've got 3 buttons. We just need 2 more. And so we'll do button. And then this is going to be the delete account button. So we'll add a BTN and then BTN-danger. And so this will say delete account. And then finally, we'll have a button for changing the account type. So this will have a class of BTN and BTN-secondary. And this is going to say change account type. All right, let's save everything for now. Let's see what it looks like. Okay, well, doesn't quite look right. What did I mess up? I think I messed up the classes. Yeah, forgot the N on these guys. Okay, so we've got that. Buttons look good. And I think we've already done account status. We've done auth, done that. Okay, so that should actually be it for the basic components. Obviously, we haven't implemented any of the logic, but in the next video, we'll get started on tackling Redux because we're going to need Redux to actually handle all of the logic. Because remember, we're going to separate the logic from the UI. Okay. All right, guys. So now we're actually going to start implementing Redux. The first thing we need to do with Redux is I want to figure out how we want to define our state, because just like with any state management library, or if you're just using the context API or local component state, you as the developer have full control over how you want to define the state. And for this application, right, if you take a look at what state we actually need, I want to first just focus on implementing this counter. So this is just going to store the balance. So we have to think about how we want to hold this value in state. And I think it makes sense to store it just as a number, right? Because all that's the only data it really needs. We just need the value that our current balance is, and nothing more. Now we don't technically have to use a number. We could technically use an object that contains a lot of data. We could use an array. We could use, if we wanted to store it as a string, we could. So we've got lots of flexibility, but I think it makes sense to represent our state as just a plain number. Okay. So to actually get started, let's go ahead and create our store. And if you've already forgotten what the store is going to hold all of the state for our application. So within index.js, we're going to import one function, and that's going to be from the Redux library. So we'll do import, and we're going to import the create store. And I think you can guess what that's going to do. Now, to actually create our store, all we have to do is define constant, and we can give this whatever name we want. I'm just going to call it store because that kind of makes sense. And then we do create store. And we're not quite done yet. So we actually have to pass in a parameter into this store. And we actually have to pass in the reducer. And that kind of makes sense. If you're kind of wondering, why do we need to pass in the reducer? Well, the reducer is ultimately responsible for, returning what the value of the state is, right? Because anytime there's any kind of action or change in our application, the reducer will take the current value of the state, it'll take an action, and then it'll return what the new value of state is. So basically, the reducer will then push that state into the store, and then the other components in our application can then access that value. So the reducer is really responsible for handling all of the logic of the state. So let's go ahead and implement our reducer so that we can pass it into this create store function. Now we can go ahead and define the reducer in this index.js file, but I think it makes sense to keep all of our reducers in a separate folder for organizational purposes. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do a new folder. We'll call this reducers. But keep in mind, this is strictly optional. If you want to just keep it within this file just to make it a little easier when you're learning Redux, by all means, go for it. Now, within our reducers folder, I'm going to create a file called bankingreducers.js. Just to make it a little bit descriptive. Then within this file, we're going to create our reducer. And what's really important here is I'm not going to define any imports. We're not going to import Redux. We're not going to do anything like that because a reducer is just a plain JavaScript function. There's no magic behind it. I'm going to do const, and then I'm going to call this banking reducer. And then this is just going to be set to an arrow function. Whoops, that is not what an arrow function looks like. Okay, and there's going to be two input arguments into this function. There's going to be the current value of the state and then an action, right? And we talked about this in the slide deck. These are the two input arguments that you need. And from here, the banking reducer can then figure out what the new value of the state should be, and it'll return that. So our function is just going to do something very simple. We're just going to do return state. And you might be wondering, well, why did we do that? Where's the rest of the code? Well, right now I don't want to implement the full functionality of our reducer yet, because I will actually want to talk about actions before I get to the reducer. But to actually be able to create the store, we need to have a valid reducer in place. So all this is doing here is, if you recall, the reducer, whatever it returns, is going to be what the new value of the state is going to be. So if I'm taking the original value of the state and then just returning that, well, what is that actually doing? Well, all it's doing is returning the old value, the old state. So basically, we're not updating the state. We're just keeping it the same value. And what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to export this function. So I'm just going to put this export right there. And this is going to make it a named export. You can also do an export default. But we're going to actually export a few other functions from this file later on. So that's why I'm just going to make this a named export. Then once we go back to the index.js, I'm going to import that. So we'll do import. And then what did I call this? Banking reducer, I think. And then I'm going to go into the reducers folder. And then within there, we've got banking reducers. So now that we have this banking reducer, we can pass it into our create store function. And we've got a store now. So we've got global state working right now. However, no component can actually access it because we haven't wired it up yet to a provider. And we're not going to do that until the very end. So I think now it makes sense for us to actually start talking about actions. Now, when it comes to tackling actions, we have to go back to our working app and see what kind of actions are actually going to take place within our application. So first and foremost, I want to only tackle the handling of the deposit, the withdraw, the collect address, and delete count. We're not going to do the change account type and the logout yet. So we're just going to focus on the core banking aspect of our app. And I think it makes sense to have 4 different actions. We're going to have one for deposit, right? Because there's going to be a certain set of instructions that are going to be responsible for handling the deposit logic. There's going to be a certain set of instructions for handling the withdraw logic, and the same thing for the collect interest and the delete account. Okay. And that's why I kind of laid out this application, because each button kind of represents a different action. However, in most applications, you may not have a button for every application. You may not have a button for every action. So just keep that in mind. It just kind of works out like that in this app, but it may not for all other apps. So we're going to have 4 different actions, and I'm just going to write those actions out as comments real quick. All right. And so our first action is going to be, actually, I'm just going to actions. And let's say we have an action for, this one's going to be for the deposit. Well, there's 2 things in action. Well, there's one absolute requirement that an action must have, and that's going to be a type parameter. Okay. And so the type is just a string that's going to represent the name of the action. So for deposit, I think it makes sense to call it deposit. And you'll see that it's a convention to just capitalize every letter. And then if you have multiple words, separate it with a underscore. So like if you want to call it a deposit action, you have underscore and then deposit, but we're just going to keep it as deposit. Now for this action, when we actually go to send this action to the reducer needs to know how much we're depositing, right? Or then there's no way for us to actually update our balance without actually knowing that value. So we need to pass in an optional payload. So we'll just pass that in as another parameter to this action object. So we'll do, we can call it payload technically, but I think let's give it a little bit more of a descriptive name. So I'll just say amount. So the amount they want to deposit. And this is going to be some value. So this could be like, $5. This can be $10. This can be $20. It's just got to be some kind of number. Okay. And so that's our deposit action. Now let's take a look at our withdraw action, right? Also notice this is not a special object, right? This has nothing to do with Redux. This is just a plain JavaScript object. So I can just do, I can literally just do const, and then we can call it deposit or something. And there you go. That's our action object. Now for withdraw, it's going to be fairly similar to the deposit. So we'll call this withdraw. And I'll just say type equals, right? Let's give it a name. I think it just makes sense to call this withdraw, but call it whatever you want. And then here, because we're taking a certain amount of money from our balance, we still need to also pass in an amount, right? So the amount value is going to get passed, and that's going to give some value that we want to withdraw. So let's say we wanted to withdraw $30. This will obviously change based off of what our input field has. But right now I'm just kind of hard coding in just to give you a better understanding of what objects actually are, what actions are actually, what actions really are. Then we have our collect interest. And so this one's going to be a little bit different. And I'm just going to call this interest, whatever. Let's call it collect interest. And so type, once again, just a name. So I'm just going to call this collect underscore interest. Then for payload, do we actually need any payload? So our bank, the way it's going to work is it's going to provide a fixed interest, and that's 3%. So we could technically pass in 3% as a payload, but that's always going to be fixed. So we could just implement that logic within the reducer and have our action just send the type, and then the reducer can know, oh, let me just add 3%. So we don't actually need to pass in a amount or another payload property because this is all the data we need. And then finally, we need a delete account. So we'll do delete account. And this object is we'll just call this delete account. The type, let's give it a descriptive name. So I think delete account is very descriptive. And then what payload do we need? Well, just like the collect interest, we don't actually need a payload because we're not passing any amount. We're not passing any other data. The reducer can know to just set it to 0. We can implement that logic within the reducer. So there's going to be no payload on this action either. So we've got our 4 different actions. And you can see that once again, they're just nothing more than just plain JavaScript objects. Okay. So now that we have our actions, I'm going to actually just copy these or delete it for now or cut it. And I'm going to go to our reducer and I'm just going to place it right here. Now, why am I doing that? This is just for reference so that we can actually handle implementing our reducer. So let's get started with implementing our reducer now. We've already got our actions in place. We know what they're going to look like. Now, to handle the reducer, the standard convention is to use a switch statement. But I do want to make it clear that that is completely optional. So what we're ultimately trying to achieve with the switch statement is we're going to basically do what a bunch of if statements would do. So we can do if, and then basically say the action.type equals, and then some type. So maybe this one's for deposit, right? And then we're gonna implement the logic for that. So we'll just say logic for deposit. And then we're going to do the same thing. So then if action.type equals, withdraw, then we're going to implement the logic for withdrawing, right? So instead of just doing, 4, 5, or 20 if statements, depending on how many different actions you have, I think it makes more sense to just use a switch statement. So this can all be replaced with a simple switch statement, and that's going to look like this. We do switch. And then we want to, switch based off of a specific variable. So action.type. And then we're going to open up our curly braces. And then for the first case, which is, deposit, when action.type equals deposit, we're going to handle the logic for that, right? Logic or deposit. And then we might have a case for withdraw. And we're going to implement the logic for withdrawing. Right, so that's how we do this with a switch statement, and that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to delete all these comments for the if statement and finish up writing the different case statements. So we're going to have one case statement for each different action. So all we're doing is the whole point of the type property within an action is just so that the reducer knows which switch statement to actually perform, so it knows which logic to handle. Then we've got case, collect underscore interest. Okay, and logic for that, whatever. And then finally, case for, what did I call it? I think it was delete underscore account. That's why I copied it here. Delete underscore account. Perfect. Yep. And then we're going to have the logic for that. Okay. So we've got our switch statement in place. You can see that Visual Studio Code is throwing in an error or a warning, and it's saying that a switch statement expects a default case. So a default case is kind of like an else statement to a whole bunch of ifs and if else statements. So it's kind of like a catch-all if it doesn't match any one of these. Now, when we're actually implementing all of this, there's technically no reason why it should never not match one of these because we're the ones always defining the actions. But with the switch statement, it's kind of required. So we're just going to do a default. And what should happen if it doesn't match any one of these? Well, I think it makes sense to just return the state. So we're taking the old state and returning it. So that basically means if we don't match any one of these cases, then we're going to keep the state exactly the same and we're not going to make any changes. Okay, so now let's handle the logic for depositing, for withdrawing, collect interest, and delete account. And the first thing that we actually have to do is we're actually going to run into an issue if we try to run this right now because we have no initial value of state. And we always need to give it some kind of initial value, right? Because whether you're using the context API or you're using the useState hook, you always have to pass in an initial state when the app loads, right? Because if we did the useState hook, right, you would do const and then, whatever our state is and then some function to modify our state. And then you do use state and then you'd give it the default value, right? So if it's a number, you'd give it like a 0 or something. Or if it's a string, you give it like an empty string or you give it some initial value for when your app starts. And we need to do the same thing. So here we can just say state equals, and you give it a default value. And so, as I stated before, right, we have to take a look at how we want to implement our state. And I think it makes sense to make our state a simple number. So our store would just be like store equals 0 or 1, 2, or 3, or 4, right? So that's what our state's going to look like. So what we can do is I can just say state equals 0, and that's going to give it an initial state. And we don't actually need this line anymore because we're returning that default state. And I'm going to delete this now. And you'll see it's throwing in an error. That's just because we're not breaking out of these switch statements, but we'll get to that later. Okay, and so this is our initial state, but I think instead of putting it as just a 0 and hard coding it right here, instead what I want to do is create a new object. So we'll do const initial state, and I'm going to set that equal to 0. Okay, and so here we'll just say the initial state's going to be set to initial state. But if you wanted to do state equals 0, that's perfectly fine. And the reason I'm doing this is because once we get to adding more features to this application, you're going to see that storing our state as just a plain number isn't going to be very versatile. And it's going to make it very difficult to add new features and add more state to our application. So eventually we'll move to an object. Our initial state will be an object, which means our actual state will be an object. And then we'll have like a parameter called balance, which will represent our balance. Okay. But right now we're going to start off just by keeping our state as a simple number because that's going to make things nice and easy. Now let's go ahead and implement the logic for the deposit. So what do we need to do to actually deposit money into our bank account? Well, the first thing we have to do is we have the state value. And what we're going to do is we'll take our state and we're going to add whatever amount of money the user wants to add, right? Now, where is that value? Well, the value is going to be stored on our action object under the amount property. So we can do action. Because remember, we're passing in the action, so we have access to it, and we can do amount. So we'll do state plus action dot amount. Now, right here, we're doing something that's very frowned upon. I'm manipulating or modifying the state directly, and that's something you never do. You never touch the state like that. Instead, what we're going to do is we return this value. Why are we returning this? Remember, the reducer is always responsible for returning what the new value of the state is. So if the user makes a deposit, what we're going to do is we're going to take the current value of the state, add the amount they want to add, and then return that value. And then remember, when we return this, this will get sent back to the store, and the store will now have a value of the original state value plus action.amount. And this makes it so that the state is still immutable. So we're not modifying it or touching it or anything like that. We're just creating a new instance of the state and storing that within the store. So let's go ahead and implement the logic for withdraw. It's going to be the same thing, except it's going to be return state. minus action dot amount. For collecting interest, it's going to be a little different. So we're going to return, what do we want to return? We want to take the original value of our state and we want to multiply it by 1.03. So that's going to increase it by 3%. And then delete account. This is easy. So we're just going to set the state to 0. So we return a 0. Okay. Hopefully that makes sense. I think it's very important that you understand why we're returning and not just modifying the state directly. All right. So now we've got our reducer in place. Let's now move to implementing our provider. All right. So we've got our reducer fixed. So, okay. So we've finished with our reducer. That's all we have to do for it. It's that simple. The next thing we need to do is create our provider component so that we can actually share the store to the rest of our application. The next thing that we have to do is actually wire up our Redux store so that it can be accessed by other components in our application. And we do that by using the custom provider component that comes from the React Redux library. So if we go back to our app component, actually, let's go back to our index page, and we're going to import. We're going to do a named import, actually. So we'll do provider, and this is going to be a capitalized P. And I'm doing a capitalized P because, remember, this is just a plain old React component, and it's standard convention to make React components all capitalized. So we'll call this provider, and we're going to import this from React Redux. I think it's important to kind of highlight this fact because the create store, this is part of the Redux library, and this is just how Redux works. But the provider component, this comes from React Redux. So this was created so that it makes it really easy to integrate Redux into our app. And that's why they provided this custom code that gives us a special component that allows us to pass down our state to all of our components. So now that we have that imported, what I want to do is we go to our React DOM.render, and what I'm going to do is just wrap our app component within this new provider component. So I'm just going to space this out a bit and drop that down a level. And I'm going to just say provider, and then just take the closing tag and wrap the there we go. Right, and say that. So whoops, it looks like I got an error. Cost is not defined state. Oh, let me just save all that. There we go. So we've got the provider component wrapping our app component, and that means we have wired up our store to our application. And it looks like I got an error. So let's see what happened. Whoops, that's not what I wanted. Where is this throwing an error? Let's see. And we've made one mistake, right? If we go back to our provider component, you can see that we're not actually passing anything into the provider component, but we actually want to give it one attribute, and that's going to be the store attribute. And here we're going to pass in our store. And so I copied to call our store store, so we just pass in store, but if it's called something else, then pass in that name. Hit save, and there you go. It's loaded up, no errors, perfect. And if we go into our component section, you'll see that our app component is now wrapped in provider as well as React Redux.provider. And so that means any of these components can now have access to our store. So in the next video, we're going to start handling, implementing the event handlers for these buttons so that we can actually make our application work. Okay, guys, so let's get started implementing the event handlers for these buttons. So I'm going to go into our banking component, and that's where all of these buttons reside. And what we're going to do is just set up an event handler for an on-click. So we'll do on-click equals. And, we could just do it directly in here. I can just do an arrow function, but it's going to get a little messy. So I'm just going to create a special event handler. So we'll call this handle deposit. Then I'm just going to copy this and paste it for all of these buttons and just give it a different event handler. And we'll call this deposit withdraw. And then this will be handle. Ugh, come on. No, that's not what oh God. We want handle, dude, what is happening? Collect interest. And then this will be handle delete. And this will be handle This is for a changing account type, so we can just we're not going to handle that now, but we'll just call this handle count change. I guess makes sense. And let's go ahead and define these functions. So we'll do const handle deposit. Just going to copy this. We're going to need a few of these. 4, 5. Okay, so handle deposit, handle withdraw, collect interest. And then what is this? Handle delete. And then finally handle change account. Yep. Any errors? Nope. Looks good. Okay. All right. So let's figure out what we need to do when the user actually hits deposit. Well, the first thing is we need to get the value of the input. Actually, what we'll need to do is we want to make this input field a controlled input. So let's go ahead and actually do that now. I should have actually done that earlier, but I completely forgot. So we'll just do const. We'll say, we'll call this balance, I guess. Yeah, well, sure. Why not? That's no, not balance, amount. And then we'll do set amount equals use state. And then it's going to be set to nothing. And so this is a classic example of how we can still use local state within our application, even if we're using Redux. And for a controlled input, using local state makes perfect sense because no other component in our application cares about that value. Value, set that to amount, and then we want to set an event handler for on change. And that's going to be set to an arrow function that is going to receive the event. And then we're just going to say set amount to e.target.value. Let's save that. Make sure nothing broke. Okay, perfect. All right, so we've got that wired up. Now let's handle the deposit logic. So really all we need to do, because the reducer that we've defined here handles the logic for incrementing the actual state, or sorry, changing the state depending on how much we want to deposit or withdraw or delete. All the component has to do is when that event handler triggers, all he has to do is just dispatch an action, right? And our actions, which they're not technically defined anywhere, but I listed them out in the reducer section here just to show you what they look like. So we just have to call an action that looks exactly like this. Okay. But we need to use this special Redux dispatch function. So if you don't use a dispatch function, right, then all we have is just a plain old JavaScript object just sitting by itself. There's no way to kind of tell it to actually run and update our state. So that's what the dispatch function's for. And the way we get access to that is by importing a special function from Redux. And I think you can guess what it's going to be called. So let's go back to our banking app. And what we want to do is const, and I'm going to call this dispatch because it seems like a solid name. And we're going to use the use dispatch, and we'll automatically import that from the React Redux library. So I think this is also another hook. So this is just another example of using another hook in React. And so this is a function that we can then use to dispatch an action. So here, I'm going to call dispatch. And what do we need to actually provide to our dispatch function? Our action. So remember, our action is going to have two properties, or one property depending on what action we want to send. So we got to send the type. And so the type, if you recall, if we go back to the examples that I listed out, for deposit, we're just going to call it deposit. Deposit. And then we need to give it the second parameter, which is the amount, right? So let's go back and just double check. Yep, amount. And then the value we need to pass it. So we'll do amount, and that's going to equal amount, right? Amount. However, keep in mind that amount is technically a string that represents the number. So we actually have to convert it to an int. So what we have to do is just say parse int and then wrap the amount in there. And so that's going to convert it to an int. So here, this is our action property, sorry, our action object, and we're going to dispatch it. So that means whenever anyone clicks the deposit button, we're going to send this action object to our reducer. And our reducer will get it. He'll pass it in as an action, as one of the input arguments. And then we'll also, and Redux knows to just grab the state from the store and pass that in there. And then from here, it'll say, well, let's see what our action.type equals. And since we know it's going to be set to deposit, we're going to take the current value of our state and we're going to add action.amount. And then we return that value, and that's going to be the new value of our store. Okay, so let's do a file save all. And let's see what happens. 5 deposit. Okay, so nothing happened, but that's expected because we didn't actually tell any of our components to use our actual our state, right? This is just a hard coded value of 100, but that should work. And so what I'm going to do is we're going to go back to our banking component and let's just implement the withdraw aspect of it. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to dispatch an object. However, we know this one's going to be called withdraw. And if we go back to our actions objects, which, you know what, I'm tired of moving back to this page over and over again. So I'm just going to take it and I'm going to just paste it right down here. Okay. So withdraw is just called withdraw, and then it's going to have an amount payload. And so we've already done that. Now let's handle the next one. And that's going to be collect interest. So I can just copy this object altogether. And I can say dispatch. And then pass in that object. Right. And so this is, by the way, guys, this is the boilerplate that I was talking about Redux, where there's just a lot of things we got to set up beforehand. But when you really look at it, it's not that complicated. It's just a little bit of a minor inconvenience. And then let's take a look at what our delete account looks like. So this is our delete account. Okay. And we'll leave handle account change blank for now because we're going to handle that later. Whoops, this should not say I messed this up. This should be a dispatch function that calls this object. So dispatch and wrap that. Okay. So let's hit save. Make sure nothing has broke. And, put in a value, deposit, withdraw, collect interest, delete account. Nothing's breaking. No errors. So it looks like it's good. I'm curious to see if we can actually see what the store value is from our React Dev tools. I'm not sure if that's actually possible, but let me check. Doesn't look like it. That's a bummer. Well, let's see what's in provider. Store, nope. Memo. Oh wait, no, I think actually we can see it right here. Actually, I think it's memo. Let's actually see if that's the case. So let's add 5. Nothing's happening. So maybe that's not it. Yeah, it doesn't look like we can actually see where that value is stored. Or maybe our application's broken. Well, let's take a look anyways. So what we're going to do is, so now that we've got our actions getting dispatched, the next thing I want to do is actually make sure that this is rendering out our store, our state. So let's go to the balance component. And here from this component, he needs to retrieve the store. So how does he do that? Well, there's actually a special hook for that as well. And it's going to be called use selector. So we're going to take the use selector hook. And here we have to, this is going to be a little confusing, but we have to pass in an arrow function where the input argument is going to be the state. And we're going to return what part of the state that we want. So this actually gives us the ability to kind of slice a portion of the state that we care about, because not all components are going to care about the entire state. They just want one specific part of it. But our state is just a number, so we can't really slice that up anymore. You can only really do that with like objects, right? So we're just going to return state. So we're going to grab the whole entire state. And what we want is to store that on a value. So I'm just going to call this, what do you guys think? Balance? Well, we'll call it store. Whatever. It's okay. Probably not the best name to call it, but. And then we'll render the store out right here. So we'll do, well, let's keep the $sign and say store. That's it. And now you can see it's set to 0. So it looks promising. If I hit 5, look at that, right? It's grabbing our state value for us. If I withdraw a dollar, whoops, I just withdrew $5. Okay, hold on. Let's add 6. And then let's withdraw 1. Let's collect interest. Look at that. We just got 3% interest. Delete account. Okay, perfect. Everything is working the way we want it to. We have set up the balance component to actually retrieve our state, and then we're rendering it out into an H1 div. All right, guys, so that is Redux in a nutshell. That was it. We don't have to do anything else, but there still is 2 other things that I want to implement. So we'll get started on that in the next video. Now, just for the sake of thoroughness, I want to show you guys how we can use action creators instead of actions. Because right now within our banking component, you can see that we dispatch an action, and that's perfectly fine. If you want to do it like that, feel free to do that. However, we can also use an action creator, which remember is just a function that returns an object. So we'll have a function for deposit that just returns this exact object. And that can help us avoid running into, like typos and things like that. So let's go ahead and implement that. And what I want to do is I want to create a new folder, and I'm going to call it actions. And then within actions, we'll make a new file, and I'll just call this bankingactions.js. And we're just going to define 4 functions for the 4 different actions that we need. So we'll do const deposit. And I'm just going to copy that 4 times. And this one's going to be called withdraw. We'll have one for collect interest. And lastly, delete. Delete account. Okay. And so the way this works is all it's going to do is return an object. And that object is going to be our action object. And so it's going to have a type payload. And instead of typing this all out myself, I'm just going to copy it. And I'm just going to paste it here. So we're just going to return that exact object. However, we do get an error because, this function has no idea what amount is. So we have to take any payload that's going to be sent in our action object and add it as a input argument. So we can just call this amount because that makes sense. All right, so let's go ahead and do the same thing for these other 4 functions. And I'm just going to copy these objects directly just to save us some time. And we're going to return this action object. My computer froze. Yep, so let's return that. And we're going to run into the same issue where we don't know what amount is in this function, so we have to pass it as an argument. And this should be a lowercase w, by the way. Then we're going to do the same thing for collect interest. So let's go back to banking and take this object. And we're going to return that here. So we'll do return. Okay. And this one doesn't have a payload, so we don't need to add any input arguments. And delete is going to be the same thing. Okay. So there we go. We have created a whole bunch of action creators. And so now we want to make sure that we actually export all of these. So we'll do export, 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 whoops, and export. And now since we're exporting here, we need to actually import it in our banking component. So we'll do import. Then what were they called again? The deposit, withdraw, collect interest, and then delete account. There we go. I'm going to import that from /actions. Ooh, no, we got to go up a level. Actions, and then banking actions. Okay. And so what we're going to do with these action creators is instead of dispatching this action, all we do is we're going to delete that, and we're going to just call that function. So this is deposit. So we call the deposit function. And remember, you got to put the parentheses because we want it when we're about to dispatch it, we want it to run the function, which will return the actual action object. So nothing's really changed from the perspective of the application because the deposit function just returns the same action object we already had. So it's just another way of doing things. It's usually the recommended way of doing things, and that's the way I'm going to do it in my applications. But if you just want to pass in the action object directly, feel free to do that. That's perfectly fine. Here we're going to call withdraw. And actually, if you notice, we're already making a mistake because we need to pass in the actual amount, right? We got to pass in the amount or then it won't have that data. Collect interest and handle delete. So this is what is a delete account. Yep. Let's save everything and let's make sure all of this is working. Most likely we broke something. What happened here? What file is this? Banking.jsx. What? Oh yeah. The example actions. We don't need that anymore. Okay, so let's try this out. We're going to deposit $77. Perfect. We're going to take out $5. Great. We're going to collect some interest. Yep. And a delete account. There you go. So now we have successfully swapped out our action objects with action creators, but our app is still exactly the same. Okay. So hopefully you guys understand the difference. I think action creators gave me a little bit of confusion when I was first learning Redux, but they're really not adding any extra functionality. It's just another way of doing things. So feel free to use whichever method you like. But in the next video, we're going to work on implementing the change account type. So now up to this point, I think you guys have a solid understanding of how Redux actually works, but there are some tweaks that we can make when it comes to how we define our state. And I think it's important for me to kind of give you a few examples to show you what we have to do to modify what our state's going to look like. And the way I'm going to do that is by adding 2 extra features to our banking app. And so the first one is changing our account type. And so this is just going to be a simple Boolean that's going to be called like is a checking account. And then if it's true, we're going to print out it's a checking account. However, if it's false, it'll say it's a savings account. So we'll by default, I think actually it might be is savings account. So savings account is going to be the default. But based off of that Boolean, we're just going to, well, I'm supposed to be on the working version. So if I flip this, that's all it's going to do. It's just going to flip a simple Boolean. So we need to add a simple Boolean to our state. And let's take a look at how we go about doing that. So where did we actually define what our state's going to look like? Well, that kind of comes from our reducer actually, right? Because we provide the initial state and that's kind of defining what it's going to look like. But also how we return it also determines what the state's going to be. So really the reducer is responsible for defining what our state looks like because it creates a new copy of the state. So he's responsible for handling that. Now, right now our state is just a simple number, but if we want to add a Boolean to this, to represent if it's a checking or savings account, well, we can't exactly do that if our state's just one simple number. So we're going to have to change our state to look like an object. So instead of just hard coding this as a number, I'm going to make our initial state a object, and it's going to have a balance property that's going to, by default, set to 0. All right, and now by making this change, we're going to be breaking our entire application. And I'm going to show you guys that real quick. So we're just going to do a save all. And look at that, right? It's throwing a whole bunch of errors. Don't worry about reading them. I already know what's wrong. I'm going to tell you guys what's wrong. By changing this to 0, what happens is when we go to look at our different switch statements or our different cases, you can see here we're trying to add state to action.amount, which means we're taking an object and we're adding a number to it. That doesn't exactly work, right? So instead of doing like this, what you probably have to do is, or what you're thinking we have to do is maybe grab our state, and then we grab the balance property, right? And we return that. And this is also going to be incorrect because right now, the initial state's going to be an object. However, when we return this, it's going to return just a plain number, right? We need to return another object. So we need to return the state in the way that it should be defined. So it's defined as a object here, and the rest of our application expects it to be an object. So what we need to do is return a new object, because that's what our state is, with a balance property set to state.balance plus action.amount. Okay. So hopefully this makes sense to you guys. All we're doing is returning a brand new object with the exact properties that we had in our initial state. So we had just balance, and so we're just updating the balance property to be the original balance plus the action.amount. And we could do the same thing with withdraw. So we want to return a brand new object that's going to represent our state and set the balance property to state.balance minus action.amount. Collecting interest going to be just as easy. We'll do balance, and that's going to be state.balance times 1.03. And then deleting account, all we have to do here is once again return an object. We don't want to return 0, and just set the balance to 0. And let's save this and watch our app still break. And why do you think it's breaking, guys? Well, I think it's easy to tell. If we go into our, where is it? Auth, I think. Sorry, not auth. We want our balance. You'll see that we're just passing in store like we normally were, but now our store looks completely different because it's an object. So if I do console.log store and go to that console.log, you'll see that our store is now an object with one property. So we can't render out an object. We need to render out that specific property. So we'll do store.balance, hit save. And now our application should work the way we expect it to. So let's try that out. So I'm going to add $5. We're going to remove $1. We're going to collect interest and delete account. Okay, so everything's working. But there's one minor tweak I want to show you guys that we can make in this component. So you'll see that the store is accessing our state, right? And we're returning the whole state. And right now that's just a simple object with one property, but we're going to add extra parameters or extra properties to this object, like the is checkings account or is savings account. And this component doesn't care if we are a checking or savings account. It only cares about the balance. So within this arrow function, we can just return state dot balance so that our component only ever cares about the balance. And then we can remove this, right? And save that. And you can see that when we console.log it, we're just getting the balance and we're rendering that out. And I think it makes sense to actually call this balance now. And then we don't need this console.log, and we'll change this to balance. Okay. So this should work. And let's just quickly test again. Great. Great, great, great. Okay. So all of these changes we had to make was so that we can implement our next feature, which is adding this simple Boolean. So let's go back to our reducer and let's add in a new initial state. So I'm going to say that we're going to define a Boolean called is savings account. And we're going to set that to false. Okay. And so now we've got this, we've got our new state, but we need to actually dispatch some actions when the user clicks this to change the value. So let's go ahead and go to our actions, and I'm going to define a new action creator. So we'll do const, and I'm going to, what should I call this, guys? We'll call this toggle account. We're going to return an object, and this is going to have a type of, we'll call this, I think toggle account's good enough. Okay, so we're going to return this object. And when do we actually want to dispatch this action? Well, we're going to do that in our banking app, but we're going to do it for the handle account change. So we'll do dispatch. And then let's make sure we import this. What did I call this? Toggle account. Yep. And we were going to call toggle account. And we'll save all. And I think this should still work. And before I actually do this, I know we're going to actually break something, but what I want to do is I want to go back to our, where is it? Our balance. So I'm retrieving our balance, specifically the balance property. But what I want to do is I want to actually also retrieve our entire store just to show you what it looks like. So I just need a dummy component that will grab the entire store so I can just console.log it. And so I'm going to grab the entire state and we're just going to console.log. We're going to say store is, and then that's in store. Okay. So we can see that the full store it's got a balance of 0 and the savings account is false. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to deposit $9. Okay. And let's see what happened. Well, there's an issue, right? Because now after I deposited money, you can see our store is just balance. We only have a balance property. We no longer have an is savings account property. And if I click on change account type, our app crashes. And oh, actually, sorry, that crashed because I messed up my I forgot to actually make this a function. So I didn't get to show you how it actually breaks. But let's deposit $7, whatever. And then let's call it change account type. Right, nothing happens. Well, remember, we actually have to wire up, we actually have to define a switch statement or a case statement within our reducer to actually handle that logic, right? Because this is going to determine how we update our state. And we only have one for deposit, withdraw, collect interest, and delete account. So let's create a new case statement and just say, if this is, what did I call this? Toggle, I think I called it toggle underscore account, hopefully. And we're going to return an object, and we're going to set the state dot. Oh, sorry, it's going to be called is savings account. It's going to be set to state dot is savings account, but we're going to just get the opposite value. So it's just going to toggle it. Let's save all. And we haven't actually wired up the logic here. So let's actually do that. So we'll go into account status. And here he needs access to the state value. So we'll do const, and then we'll say is savings account. And that's going to be set to use selector. And remember, we're taking our state and return state. And we're going to just pass in the dot is savings account property, because that's all we really care about in this component. And then here, we're just going to do a simple ternary operator. So we'll say if is savings account, then we want to return a simple string that says savings account. And then if it's not that, then we want to return the checking account. Okay, so let's and right now I just reloaded the page, so you can see that because is savings account starts out as false, it means that we're a checking account. So I'm going to deposit $8, and notice the store. Okay, this is very important. You can see that the balance is 0 and the is savings account is set to false. If I deposit $8, balance is 8, and now we no longer have an is savings account property, which seems unusual, right? And then if I hit a change account type, well, now we have an is savings account property, but we no longer have a balance property. So what exactly is happening, right? Because we no longer have that property, look, we can no longer render that out. Well, it all comes back to how our reducer works. Remember, when we return the new state, this is the exact state that it's going to return. So we are returning an object with just a balance property here. And that's why whenever we hit deposit, we get rid of the is savings account property because we're returning a new object with just a balance property. And the same thing goes for the toggle account. We're returning a brand new object with is savings account property set, but there's no balance property set. So we're just removing it because this is the actual state after this reducer runs. So what we have to do is, the first thing we need to do under every single one of these lines is we want to copy our initial state. So we're going to just take the spread operator and spread that. We're going to spread our state object so it makes a full copy. And then all we're doing here is we're updating the balance property. Okay. So this copies the state into a brand new object. And then this just updates the specific property within that object we want to update. And we're going to have to do this with all of them. So dot, dot, dot state, comma. So this should fix our bug. And let's give that a shot. So $6. Okay. You can see our store still looks great. Let's withdraw a dollar. Store still has both properties. Let's delete account. Still good. Let's change account type. Awesome. Look, everything's working. So hopefully you guys understand what's happening here. This is no different than what we had to do when we were using useState, and our state was our local state was an object or an array. We always had to spread the original state value so that we copy it, and then we just update the individual properties. But this just circles back to the whole idea of the state itself isn't immutable, and we are returning a brand new state object every time. I can't reiterate that enough. I need to make sure that you guys truly understand that we are returning a brand new state object. So we have to copy all that data we had in before when we're creating this new state object, or then we just lose all that data. Okay, guys, so we finished implementing this feature. The last feature we need to implement is our authentication system, and we will tackle that in the next video. Okay, guys, we're almost done with our app. The last thing we need to do is implement our authentication system. So if we take a look at the completed app, the way that it works is when you're logged in, the button will show you a logout button. And when you click that, it's going to flip some Boolean that's stored in state. And so it's going to log us out. And then when we're logged out, we'll have a login text on the button. And so if we click that again, it's going to log us back in. So we just have a simple Boolean that's tracking the state of our authentication. Obviously, this isn't how authentication works, but we're going to just use this to demonstrate how we can have multiple reducers in our application. So it's important. I wanted to set this up like that, but I didn't actually want to implement a full authentication system because that's outside of the scope of this course as well as Redux. So anyways, let's take a look at our code and see how we can actually start implementing that. Now, if we go to our reducer section, your first thought is if we want to store our authentication status in our state, it just makes sense to add it to our current state, right? So we would just add another property called is logged in, right? And then start it out as false, right? And boom, done, right? And then just set up a new case statement for, toggle login or something like that, and then be done with it. And I'm going to tell you that that is a perfectly acceptable solution. And if you wanted to do that, by all means, it'll work. You'll have no issues with that. However, there's one thing I want to point out, and that is if you take a look at the first two properties, we got the balance and his savings account. And you'll see that both of those are kind of, your bank account related information. However, authentication seems like it's a completely separate state where it has nothing to do with your balance or your banking or anything like that. And I think that's kind of important because, we want to keep our states separate. So our banking state is going to contain all the state for our banking portion of our application. And for our authentication, I think it makes sense to store that in its own state. And that way they're not getting intermingled because they have nothing to do with one another, right? Whether you're logged in or not, it's not going to impact your balance or anything like that. So I think it's best to keep both of those things separate. And you're probably wondering, well, how do we actually implement a separate set of state? Because until now, we just added properties onto our current state. And your best guess is probably going to be that if you go back to our index.js, we just create a new store and then wire that up and then pass that as a property into our provider. And that's incorrect, right? We don't want to have multiple stores. Although I think I read somewhere that you can actually do that, but that's not what we want to do. We want to have one store that contains all of our state, but we want to find a way to actually separate the authentication state from our banking state. And the way to do that is actually defining a brand new reducer. Because right here, we've got our banking reducer, and we can actually define a second reducer and then join these two reducers together to return one state. So let's go ahead and implement our second reducer. And I'm going to call that authentication reducer or auth reducer. And you would normally want to put this on a separate file. So we'll do a new file, and I'm going to call this authreducers.js. So let's create an init state. And, we could just, say this is false and then have it represent as a simple Boolean. But you'll see that remember, we ran into an issue when we were modifying the banking reducer where once we wanted to add extra properties to our state, we had to refactor all of it. So I think it makes sense to actually go ahead and just start out with an object and then just have an is logged in property that's going to start out as false. And that way, if we decide to add in extra properties like, once the user's logged in, what is the username? We would need that data to be stored. What is their profile pic, right? So there's going to be other data that we probably want to implement in our authentication state. So I would say keep it as an object and just have one simple property. And that's a good rule to follow. Now let's actually define our reducer. So we'll call this auth reducer. And that's going to equal an arrow function. And here we're going to get our state and an action. And just like before, we're going to have a switch statement, and we're going to switch on action.type. And for our first case, when it's going to be set to, let's define what we're going to name that specific action. So we'll say toggle auth. So if we receive that action, all we're going to do is we're going to return a new object like we normally do. And we'll spread our state because we don't know what other properties we're going to add to this in the future. So let's copy all of it. And then let's update our is logged in state and set that equal to state.is logged in and just flip it. So we want to just, if it's false, set it to true. If it's true, set it to false. And then lastly, we need to default and we'll just return state. All right, so we've got our reducer in place. And let's export that as well. Now let's see how we can actually take this second reducer and add it to our store essentially. So I'm going to go back to our index.js and let's see where we implemented the banking reducer. So when we called create store, we passed in the reducer. But here's the problem. The create store doesn't take a second reducer. Like we can't just add in auth reducer and just be done with it. It doesn't. It can only accept one reducer. So what we actually have to do is we have to use a special function that's called combine reducers. And what combine reducers does is it takes multiple reducers like we have, and you can have as many as you want probably, and it returns a single reducer that we can pass into our create store function. And what it's going to do is the resulting reducer will call every child reducer and gather their results into a single state object. Okay, so that's exactly what we need. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to our reducers file and add a second or a third file just to make things a little more confusing. And we'll call this combine reducer. And we have to import the combine reducer function. So we'll do import combine reducers, and that's going to come from the Redux library. And what we want to do is we want to import both the auth reducer and the banking reducer. So we're already exporting the banking reducer and we're now exporting the auth reducer. So let's import those into our combine reducer. So I'm going to do import and then what did I call it? Banking reducer. And then from /banking reducer. And then we'll do import. We'll do auth reducer from /auth reducers. I think that should be good. Now to actually use the combine reducer, it's dead simple. So we'll give it a name. So I'm just going to call this, call it root reducer, but you can give it whatever you want. You can call it combined reducer or something like that. And then we just say, set it equal to combine reducers. And here we have to pass in an object. And this is very important, guys, because this is how we're going to ultimately define what our state is going to look like. So we're going to say, we're going to pass in a specific property for each one of our reducers. So we can give it any name we want. I think for the auth reducer, I think it makes sense to just call it auth. You can call it authentication, you can call it whatever you want. And then for the value for this property, we just pass in our auth reducer that we imported. And we're going to do the same thing for our banking reducer. So we can call this property whatever we want. I'm just going to call it banking. And then we want to call the banking reducer. Okay. And I want you to pay attention to how this is set up because this is what our state is going to look like. So our store, when all is said and done, is going to look like an object like this. And it's going to be an object and it's going to have two properties. It's going to have auth and it's going to have banking. Now, the value of these properties is going to depend on the child reducers. So whatever auth reducer is returning, if we go back to auth reducer, it's going to return something that looks like this, an object with one property. So I'm going to copy that. I'm just going to paste it in here just to show you guys. So this is going to look like that. And then banking, well, what is banking going to look like? Well, let's just go to our reducer and let's see the format it's returning things. And it's going to return something like this. And remember, we don't need the is logged in anymore on this guy. So we'll copy that. And we'll get to our combined reducer, paste that in there. And I'm just going to add const here just to show you, just so it automatically formats it into something nice and pretty, which it did not do. And that's because this should be a colon. And let's see if I save. Okay, so this is ultimately what our store is going to look like when all is said and done. And so anytime a component wants to retrieve a value in here, it needs to understand that this is what this state looks like. So I'm just going to comment this out because I just did that for demonstration purposes. And notice I'm exporting this root reducer here, okay? And if we go back to our index.js, we want to import that root reducer. So we'll do import root reducer from /reducers/ combine reducer. And now I'm going to pass that root reducer into the create store. So that way we can kind of get around the loophole of only being able to pass in one reducer. That's not right. All right, we'll hit save. Well, we'll probably need to save all. And so far, actually, I realized we haven't actually wired up our auth component, account status, not account auth. So we have to wire up the authentication system. So we'll just do const auth equals, and we'll set this to use selector. And here, remember, we take the state, we pass it in, and then we return either the whole state or whatever part of the state that we want. And if we go back to our combined reducer, remember, this is what our state's going to look like. So we definitely don't want anything from banking. So we don't want to grab the whole store. Instead, we can either grab all of auth or we can grab auth.isLoggedIn if we just want that specific property. But you could just choose whatever you want. So I'm just going to grab auth because maybe later on we're going to add a few extra properties that may come in handy for our authentication button. But for now, that's all we have right now. So that should be fine. So we'll do state.auth. So we're grabbing just the authentication slice of our state. And here, I'm just going to pass in a ternary operator. So we'll say auth.isLoggedIn. Then we want to return, so if he's logged in, we want it to say log out. And if he's not logged in, we want it to say log in. So let's hit a save all and let's test this out. Whoa, 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 whoa. What happened here? Yeah, I clearly butchered something. So let's take a look at our reducers. Oh, I also forgot to pass in a default state. That's a big no-no. Let's do init state. Let's see if that fixes my issue. Oh, it did. So that was the problem. Okay, so let's test this out. Oh, we never fixed the actual rendering of the number. So if we go back to balance, so we've broken a lot of our code because we've changed what the state looks like. So now there's no actual state.balance, right? because if we go back to our combine reducer, state dot balance, the balance is within the banking. So we have to do state dot banking dot balance. So let's go back here and let's change that to state dot, whoops, where is it? Where is it? Where is it? Balance, here we go. State dot banking dot balance. The account status, we broke this as well. So we want state dot banking dot is savings account. We'll save that. Now let's get to our auth. So we got state.auth. That's fine. I think that should be it. So let's double check. And let's type something in here. So 5. Good. Let's withdraw $1. Nice. Let's collect some interest. Delete the account. Change account type. That's working. And let's check the authentication. Yep. That. Come on, guys. What did we do? What did we do here? What's wrong? Is logged in. Oh yeah, we didn't trigger an event handler. So we have to do on. So we'll do on click equals. And we'll just say handle auth. And let's define our event handler. So we'll do const handle auth equals. So what should we do here, guys? Well, we need to remember dispatch an action, right? Because we've clicked the button, we need to, dispatch something to the reducer so the reducer can update our authentication state. So let's import use dispatch. So we'll do const dispatch equals use dispatch. And we'll dispatch. What are we going to dispatch, guys? Well, if you remember from a few videos ago, did we? So we need to actually define a action creator that's going to return a action that we want. Or obviously we could also just manually put in the action that we want as well. But I think it makes sense to use the action creator. And that's the direction I'm always going to go in all of our apps. So let's go back to our authentication reducer, and we called it toggle auth. So let's copy that and let's go to our actions. And we really should put the authentication actions in a separate file because it doesn't really have anything to do with the banking actions, but I don't feel like importing and exporting that. So I'm just going to shove it in here. But know that best practice, we want to put that in a separate file. And so we'll call this toggle auth. And we'll say we'll just return an object type, and it's going to be set to toggle auth. Okay, so remember what's happening here is once we dispatch this object, we're going to get sent to the auth reducer. The auth reducer will get it. It'll match this case statement. We're going to copy our current state, and then what we'll do is we'll take the is logged in and just flip that value. So let's go back to our banking app and nope, not our banking, our nope, our auth app. And first of all, we need to actually import that action creator. So we'll do, actually, let's see if VS Code can automatically import it. What did I call it? Toggle. Yes, it should automatically. There we go. And it imported it. So guys, make sure you take advantage of the shortcuts that VS Code provides. It's going to save you so much time. And we want to make sure we want to call that function so it returns an object. And now, well, first of all, let's make sure we didn't break anything else. Good. Good. Yeah, we're in debt now. Yep. And perfect. Our authentication is working exactly how we want it to. Let's make sure that it's actually triggering the changes though. So press that and now it's changed to true. So yeah, everything looks like it's working. That's Redux in a nutshell. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, and hopefully I did a decent enough job of explaining how this works. But in all honesty, I think even with this example, there's still probably going to be a lot of confusion with you guys when it comes to how Redux works. So just like we did with all the other topics, we're going to keep hammering it away. I've got some more slightly more complex projects that involve Redux, so we want to make sure we get these concepts down before we get to those.